Picture yourself in a small barracks module drifting in low orbit. The only sounds are soft air systems, muted engines, and the faint metallic settling of a ship. Nothing is happening. Nothing is expected of you. Tonight's military sci-fi tale unfolds with that same slow, steady rhythm, easy to follow, easy to fall asleep to. The night has taken on a soft, tactical calm. Our story begins within that atmosphere, slow, grounded, steady. Let's enter it. I remember the hum more than anything, not the kind you hear, the kind that sits in the bones and in the back of the eyes. On the approach to Harlow's central spine, it was constant. The troop carrier rode the corridor like a bead on a wire, and every fluctuation in the field translated into that low pressure behind my teeth. I lay in the rack in my shell, strapped in, helmet open, staring at the condensation on the overhead. The ship groaned around us. Somewhere down the spine of the carrier, drives adjusted to the invisible curvature of the tunnel through compressed space. I had done 100 of those runs. You stop noticing the fear after a while. The body finds something else to focus on. Pain in the hip, the slow pulse of chemical boosters in the veins, the faint tick of teeth where a molar cap never sat right after impact. This run was different in a way I could not explain to the new ones. The corridor itself felt heavier. The mesh in my back and skull picked up traces of something pressing along the tunnel, a weight leaning on the line. I knew what that meant. The static was watching. It always did, eventually. Somewhere behind the bulkhead, a tech coughed. Metal rattled. I studied the fine scratches on the inner surface of my shell. Most of them were mine. A few were from whoever had taken the shell before me down into a burn and not come back out. Before the run, they had taken me off the 12th Descent's regular roster and walked me down into a compartment with no windows and too much air. Internal command types with clean uniforms, unscuffed boots. They ran the usual checks over my file. Age, missions, medical anomalies, phase mesh data. One of them mentioned that my spinal lattice still tracked corridor harmonics within 2% of original install. That meant the damage from the earlier seizures hadn't blown all the useful calibration yet. They needed that, they said. Just my luck. They put a hollow on the table. The central spine above Harlow hung there in miniature, lines of light extending from it like a spiderweb, each line labeled with distant systems. The spine had been just another piece of infrastructure for years, a big one, but still. You drop from orbit, you land, you fight in someone's mud. The spine is just the gate at the edge of the road. Not anymore. I listened as they explained what Marshal Reese-Cade had done, how he had taken alien equations from crashed relics and welded them into the control systems, how he had gone into the spine personally with a cadre of specialists, how he had not come out again. His body was still alive, they said. Alive in a technical sense, integrated. Difficult word, that. It meant he had become part of the same field we were riding now. He was doing something no one had tried, using his nervous system as a node to feel the static pushing along the corridors and push back. Every ship, every frequency, every transit impulse from hundreds of colonies went through that central node, through him. Hard to argue with results. Static events had dropped. System kills were less frequent. Civilians kept using the corridors, not knowing that every trip through the compressed tunnels was like waving a flag at a predator's nest. The cost was simple. One man at the center, more machine than human, holding it all together by will and hardware. The cost is never simple. They knew that, even if they did not say it out loud. Now, the spine was drawing fleets toward itself without orders from anyone but Cade. Traffic patterns that made no sense. Convoys diverted. Patrol flotillas recalled. Lines rerouted through Harlow whether it was efficient or not. Some captains claimed their ships changed course without input. Others went silent near the spine and never reappeared anywhere else. A centralized mind, learning that it could do more than defend. So they needed someone who could walk into the field and not be erased outright. Someone with a spine full of the same kind of mesh, tuned to those frequencies. Someone expendable. That part they never said. They did not have to. They also brought in leverage. A woman in civilian cloth, observation band on her wrist, kept her eyes on the deck most of the time. Late 20s, maybe. Hard to say beneath the malnutrition and the tension. They did not introduce her properly. They did not need to. Cade's blood looked a certain way, and the file in front of me spelled the rest out in clipped words. Estranged daughter, different surname, kept away from the front until the war ignored old boundaries. She did not talk. I did not ask her name. It was not my job. I just watched the way her hands trembled and then went still when they said she would be going into the spine with us. Now she sat strapped in across the aisle in her thin pressure harness, eyes closed, lips moving silently. Not prayer. I had seen enough of both. This was rehearsed self-control. She wore a sealed collar with a sensor bundle, cables running up into the hull. Whatever control they thought they had over Cade went through that band and the phase mesh in my nervous system. Between us, we were supposed to be the keys. The drop alarm chimed, dull through the hull. The corridor was about to spit us out into Harlow's sky, near the spine. I closed my helmet and watched the world shrink to the HUD. The transition burned through my head like a wire dragged across exposed nerves. One moment, compressed space, no motion, no stars, just the inner reflection of the tunnel's light. The next, reality snapped back. The carrier shuddered in normal space above Harlow. The hum in my bones broke into a higher whine as the corridors around the spine lit and dimmed in cycles, too fast and complex to follow. Harlow hung below, a gray planet with streaks from old orbital strikes and cloud formations bent, where earlier static brushes had tipped the weather patterns permanently out of place. The central spine rose from the day side, corkscrew column of metal and field scaffolding that pierced out past low orbit and into the zone where corridors anchored. Our pods detached in sequence, dark bullets dropping toward the upper atmosphere. Gravity pressed down. The squad's heartbeats appeared as faint icons on my HUD. 12 of us, plus the leverage asset nested in a safer shell with extra dampers. The shells around us vibrated as atmospheric molecules clawed at ablative plates. The guidance system burned, micro thrusters nudging trajectories to align with one of the spine's mid-level maintenance rings. We came in cold to keep emissions down. Just mass and falling metal. Defenses lit anyway. Harlow's anti-orbital batteries had been integrated into the spine's command net long ago. Now they read us as ambiguous returns. The IFF tags on our shells flickered. The field around the spine shifted, new harmonics blowing through my implants like sand in a storm. Some part of Cade felt us and had not decided what we were. Coherent light lanced past. One pod tumbled as a beam grazed its flank. The pilot fired all thrusters, wrestled with momentum, vanished behind me in the stack. A heartbeat later, the pod's icon went hard red and then empty. Another return lost. No parachute, no transponder. I rode out the last seconds in automatic posture, hands tight on the grips, legs braced. The hull slammed the docking ring, magnetic clamps triggered, systems acknowledged. Shell panels blew in segments, and cold, thin air fluttered in, tasting of ozone and oil, and that faint metallic tang you only get in structures that have never seen open sky. I stepped out into the spine. Low gravity. Enough to make feet useful, not enough to make you trust the floor. Emergency strips burned along the corridor edges in dirty yellow. Overlays flared on my visor as the suit's sensors tried to map the local field. The data came back messy. Geometry was off by fractions. Walls felt closer than they were. The phase mesh in my spine itched like a rash under armor. I counted helmets. 10. Plus the woman in her slimmer reinforced harness suit, a few steps behind the point element. Her visor was opaque, but I could see the slight cant of her head as she watched the zeroed rifles ahead of her. We moved. Assault training makes a rhythm out of it. One sector at a time, sectors made of junctions and chokes and open spaces. You mark lines on your internal map. Clear, clear, uncleared. You do not think about the entire structure, just the next corner and the next door. The spine was supposed to be familiar. Standardized design across the network with variations for local gravity and docking needs. This one was different. Some bulkheads had been grown, not built. Metallic surfaces with subtle organic patterning, like bone remodeled under strain. Joints that did not match any engineering manual. Insulation that pulsed faintly with field flux. Cade's modifications lived in the walls. Our first contact was mechanical. A drone in a junction, squat chassis with 4 legs and a turret head. It registered us late. The point man's rifle puffed, hard slugs punching through joints. The drone's return fire shredded a door panel and filled the junction with plastic dust. It was over in 2 seconds. We stepped through the wreckage. The drone's optics still glowed, flickering as Central Command tried to reassert control through a broken brain. We met humans 3 nodes later. They wore station armor, improvised and augmented, patches of spine access clearance still on their shoulders. Their eyes did not track like free men. There was a lag, a flatness. The phase mesh hummed when they turned toward us. Something in their skulls talked to the same field in my back. They opened fire without warning. Tight patterns. Good discipline. We answered. We had heavier suits, better rifles, and no reluctance left in us this far into the war. The corridor choked with fragments and frozen vapor. 2 of ours went down. One spattered across the wall where a lucky shot found the seam under his arm. My boots skidded on his blood as I pressed past, rifle steady, clearing corners, putting rounds into any limb that still twitched. The woman stayed in the rear, shielded by my bulk and another trooper's. She watched the defenders fall and did not flinch. She had expected this, I thought. Maybe not the specifics, but the shape. My implants carried a burst then, not through ears or suit radio, directly into the lattice in my spine and skull. A text payload compressed. Command update from outside the spine, piggybacked on one of the corridor control channels. Marshal Cade had taken 3 more fleets under his direct routing in the last hour. 2 convoys had been pulled off regular paths and rerouted toward Harlow against standing orders from their sector commands. Several spines elsewhere had gone into reduced traffic mode without explanation. Central interpreted that as escalation. Cade was concentrating power, preparing for something. The update included a line of authorization codes, special contingency unlocked. If I reached the core, they said, and determined that bringing Cade back was impossible or too dangerous, I had authority to do something else. They called it a full corridor collapse event, a synchronous overburn. Every spine, every corridor, one coordinated act. I did not need an engineering degree to understand what that meant. I had ridden corridors since they were new. I had watched one go wrong, seen a system flicker and die from orbit as the static brushed against it. The corridors were wires in a field of predators. Cut the wires, and maybe the predators lost interest, or at least lost the easy lines to follow. They were asking for permission to amputate the species' limbs at the joints to prevent infection. They could not give that order from a desk. They needed someone close enough to see and to bear it. The squad's icons pulsed as heart rates rose. They did not know the details, only that we had to keep moving. We pushed deeper. The geometry worsened as we approached the core levels. Stairwells that twisted too far within too small a radius. Chambers whose ceilings were higher inside than the surrounding schematics allowed. Sensor returns came back smeared. The phase mesh in my bones felt as if it were being plucked by unseen fingers, harmonics creeping up the scale. Then the spine did something I had never felt before. It flared. A corridor transit went live somewhere above, maybe several at once. The field lines ran down through the structure. Energy levels spiked. For an instant, my implants carried not just the usual low background hum, but something like a shout. The static pressed along the corridors. I felt it as a pressure front, not an entity, not a presence, just an anti-pattern, a negation riding the same rails our ships used. It tasted of vacuum burns and the absolute silence of dead stations. It reached for Harlow's spine. For us. Cade pushed back. The force of that counterstroke went through him, through the spine, and through my mesh. My vision whitened at the edges. My knees buckled inside the suit. For a second, I was sure the circuits in my spine would fuse and leave me limp and blind. A trooper beside me dropped entirely, legs curling in, suit slack. Another slammed a gauntlet into the wall repeatedly, teeth grinding, caught in some loop between muscle and implant. Blood ran from his nose in slow droplets that drifted in the thin gravity. I rode it out, not by strength, just by habit. You get used to holding position under too much load. I let my body sag against the corridor wall, breathing shallow, counting the heartbeat icon pulses in my visor. 1, 2, 3. Enough. The flare passed. The static's weight receded. Cade's field steadied. 2 more squad icons went dark. We continued with 8. The woman still walked, although her vitals were a jagged mess on my HUD. The collar around her neck glowed faintly where its own sensors fought to interpret the surge. Her father had just driven a force through the field that would have cracked any normal brain. She had inherited just enough of his pattern that it did not kill her outright. At one junction, the spine presented us with a choice that did not exist on the schematics. 2 corridors, both labeled as maintenance access to the same ring. Both impossible given the structure's external dimensions. I stood in the crossways, listening to the mesh, feeling the faint pull one way more than the other. We took the path that hurt more. It led us closer to the core. Contact blurred after that. Drones, gun emplacements that popped out of hidden wells and stitched the air with metal. Human defenders whose bodies moved with external impulses. The squad's drills carried us through on reflex. Cover, suppression, grenades, room after room. Time lost meaning inside the spine. There were no windows. External references on the HUD were unreliable near the core. The local gravity gradient kept shifting, and the hum in my bones rose steadily. Pulse. Like a heart. Too big to fit in any imaginable chest. We lost 3 more before we reached the final access plates. 5 helmets remained around me. Mine. 4 others. And the woman, staggering now, one hand occasionally touching the bulkhead like she needed to feel something solid. The last bulkhead was different. The metal there had a sheen oil never gave. Lines of alien script ran in a spiral toward the center. Human weld marks cut across some of it, and the scorch traces from earlier breaching attempts marred others. Someone had tried to force this door before, and failed. My implants resonated with it. The field inside vibrated at the same harmonic the mesh had been tuned to years back. I could see the pattern in the HUD overlay, like a knot in several dimensions. The codes in my spine, the authorization burst from command, and the signal from the woman's collar all tangled together. I stepped closer and let my gauntleted hand rest on the plate. The metal felt warm even through composite and insulation. The mesh engaged. Pain came first. It always does. Every time the phase lattice locks to something external, it uses nerves and bone to bridge gaps. My vision tunneled. The suit's environmental readouts blurred. Somewhere behind me, a trooper said something over the squad channel, but I did not parse it. Too many signals. Too much noise. I pushed anyway. The door responded. The spiral lines brightened, moving like a slow whirlpool. Field intensity climbed. The phase mesh latched onto the existing pattern and extended it, found new resonance points, opened pathways. Somewhere in that structure, Marshal Reese Cade sensed the intrusion. His attention brushed against me like a search beam. There was no voice, no words, Just a recognition, a similar lattice, smaller, standing on the threshold. Something that could be used. The bulkhead dilated. Metal parted into petals and withdrew. Beyond lay the core chamber. I have seen reactors before, big ones, starship hearts, groundside plants, buried fusion stacks. The core of the central spine was not like those. It was larger, yes, and brighter, and the energy levels in the air made every hair on my arm stand up under the suit. But it was the presence in it that set it apart. Cade hung at the center of a lattice of struts, cables, and field lines, or what used to be Cade's body. It had been stretched longitudinally, vertebrae lengthened, ribs arched out and fused into mounts. Limbs reduced to conduit clusters and interface trunks. The skull was encased in a transparent shell with 1,000 fine leads sunk into cortex and brainstem. Organ support tanks pulsed behind the chest cavity, feeding what fragments of organic tissue remained. It was obscene in a technical way, not in a sacred one. A machine built around a body rather than a body in a machine. The static pressed along the corridors that intersected in that chamber. I could feel it as a constant outlying noise in the mesh, like distant thunder under everything. Cade held it back. Through the core, through his ruined nervous system, he monitored every transit, nudged field lines, deflected peaks. I could see it in the HUD overlay. Each time a corridor flared, his heart spasmed, his brain lit. Where the static pushed hardest, his biochemistry faltered. The support systems compensated, flooding him with stabilizers. An endless process of killing and restoring, second after second. That was what we had built the war on. That tortured node at the center of the web, catching the blows meant for our worlds. Around the core chamber, platforms spread out at different angles, held in place by gravity tricks. Automated turrets tracked us as we stepped onto the nearest one. Human defenders there did not wait for orders. Their weapons came up in unison, eyes flat and unblinking. My rifle was already at my shoulder. The fight was mechanical. Angles, rates of fire. I watched tracers stitch patterns across armor, saw a trooper beside me take a round through the shoulder joint and spin out, momentum carrying him over a railing. He disappeared into the field below without a sound. Another made it 3 steps forward before a turret found the gap between his helmet and collar. I advanced because there was nowhere else to go. Rounds sparked off my chest plates. Fragments whined past my helmet. The phase mesh screamed in my nerves. I put slugs center mass into bodies that toppled in slow arcs under reduced gravity. Gases vented. Blood globes drifted. I moved until the indicators showed no more active threats within line of sight. The squad count was 2 plus me, and the woman, crouched behind a maintenance spur, suit scraped, one glove torn. I stood at the edge of the platform, staring up at the core. The field lines around Cade's suspended body reached out like strands. Some of them touched my mesh, testing. What they found there was compatible. In that moment, I saw too much. No images, just patterns. Each corridor in the network appeared as a line of pressure, each spine as a node. The static pressed along some of them, distant and enormous, flickering through our universe like a hand probing thin ice. Every transit lit the network. Every coil firing, every ship sliding through compressed space, a heartbeat that drew attention. Cade had met that pressure for years, modeling it, blocking it, diverting it. His understanding of physics had become intuitive at a level no unaugmented brain could reach. But the cost in flesh and mind was obvious. The core readouts showed organ decay, cortical scarring, immune collapse. The only reason he still functioned was the suit of machinery propping him up, and the alien math the system used to run his brain at the edge of what neurons could endure. If he stopped now, if the core shut down, the static would rush in along the open corridors. It would test the unshielded nodes. Some systems would die instantly, others would survive a while. But as long as the wires were there, the Predator had cause to keep looking. There was a third option, implied but not stated in the command burst. Use the phase mesh in my spine as a control bridge. Take the system out of Cade's failing brain and run it through mine. Become the new node. Younger flesh, more time to hold the web. I considered it. I thought of the troopers who had died just to bring me to this platform. The ones whose names would be stored under casualty reports and used in speeches about sacrifice. I thought of the convoys diverted toward Harlow, ships whose captains had felt their controls go slack as some distant field overrode them. Of the civilians who had no idea their trips between stars were paid for with meat in a cage. I also thought of the worlds that would go dark to each other if I collapsed the network. Thousands of colonies, many not self-sufficient. Stations whose only lifeline was bulk cargo through the corridors. People born in one system and expecting to die in another. All of them suddenly locked in place. No way to share, no way to flee from whatever local disasters came next. I was not a politician. I was not a strategist. I was a sergeant with too many drops on his joints and hardware in his bones that made him useful here. They had given me authorization because someone had to push the button, and they preferred that person not sit behind a desk. The woman stepped up beside me. Her faceplate was transparent now. I saw Cade's bone structure in the set of her jaw. I also saw the exhaustion of too many days under pressure, the faint tremor in the muscles at the corner of her mouth. I did not see hope, just resigned understanding. She looked at the core, then at me. I could tell what she wanted without words, for me to bring him back somehow, to extract him from the machinery, to deliver him diminished but alive. There was no way to do that. Even if we cut all the leads and pulled the body free, the mind that had run the web would die in the act. What we would carry out would be a husk, a symbol to parade, nothing more. She knew it. I knew it. My implants flared once more, carrying a final compressed burst from internal command. Their sensors outside the spine had registered another static surge in one of the distant nodes, entire system blinking in and out of the war map. They were begging me now, in clean military language, to decide. I stepped forward, off the platform. The suit's gravitic clamps engaged with the core's structural field, letting me walk on nothing toward the central mass. The field lines thickened as I approached. The mesh in my bones thrummed in sympathy. My vision narrowed, HUD elements dissolving into noise and raw signal. At arm's reach from Cade's suspended chest, I stopped. The heat from the core burned through the armor. His ribcage rose and fell shallowly under the network of tubing. His eyes were open inside the skull shell, but the gaze did not focus. They tracked patterns only he could perceive, lines of threat and traffic across stars. I reached out and put my gauntleted hand against the transparent shell over his skull. The system did the rest. Phase mesh seeks resonance. It always has. Once contact was made, the lattice in my nervous system and the one wired into Cade's brain coalesced into a single structure. Not perfectly. Enough. The field routed around damaged tissue and failing circuits, found new paths through my spinal cord, my cortex, my peripheral nerves. I felt my own heart misfire as the load increased. Adrenal glands dumped their last stores. Blood vessels constricted and dilated in patterns driven by something beyond my conscious will. The suit's medical systems did what they could. Stimulants, coagulants, cooling, all of it background noise against the surge. The static saw me too. The corridors lit in my perception. Every spine in the network was a bright knot. Every transit a spark. The static's pressure indexed along those lines, testing for vulnerabilities. Some nodes flickered where earlier events had weakened the structure. Others were fresh and bright, their spines still unscarred. I could hold it for a time, maybe for a year, maybe less, run the corrections, divert the worst of the pressure, watch more systems die in slow motion. Let humanity enjoy the illusion of safety while its entire civilization depended on a man bolted into a machine, never sleeping, never stopping. The thought did not disturb me. Disturbance requires energy. I was too tired. So I looked at the configuration of the web as a whole and considered the other option. If every corridor overburned at once, the static would be hit with noise far above its usual operating background. The tunnels would tear in ways they were not designed to tear. The compressed space between nodes would collapse. The spines would be destroyed or crippled. The wires would go dark. The predator would lose its easy tendrils into our side of reality. It could always find other paths, but not with the same efficiency. Not along the bright, straight lines we had so helpfully provided. There was no guarantee. There never is. But in the few microseconds stretched out across my perception, it was the only move that did not lead inevitably to one more man in one more cage at the center of a growing hive. My fingers tightened against the skull shell. The core systems recognized the new pattern of commands emerging through my mesh. They hesitated, then obeyed. I sent the signal. Across the network, every spine's control field received the same instruction. Every corridor anchoring system engaged in overburn. The equations that kept the tunnel stable were inverted. Frequencies driven past safe tolerances, energies that normally spread over long transit windows were condensed into lethal spikes. The effect ran faster than light because the corridors were already open. The web collapsed inward as a single act. The static reacted. The pressure on the lines surged in confusion and violence. It reached along paths that no longer held. It struck nodes that were already vaporizing. It found nothing stable to grip and, for the first time since we had built the network, had no obvious targets. I felt worlds disappear from my perception, not because they died, but because the corridors that made them visible to the web were gone. The stars they orbited still burned. The people on their surfaces still breathed. They were just removed from the lattice that had connected them. On some of those worlds, ships in mid-transit would be lost. Corridors collapsing with vessels inside them do not leave survivors. On others, stations entirely dependent on imported air, food, or fuel would count days until the last reserves ran out. The deaths from that would not be swift enough for anyone to call merciful. I understood all of that in a detached way, the way you understand that pulling a trigger will send a projectile into someone's chest. You know the organs inside. You know the probable outcome. You still squeeze. The field burned through my nervous system as the network tore. My vision fills with white static. Pain became an abstract region on the edge of perception. The body underneath the armor convulsed. The suit reported catastrophic neural overload and began shutting down functions in an attempt to preserve something. Cade died in that moment. His brain, already at the threshold, could not handle the inversion. The leads feeding into his skull lit a bright, final line in my awareness and then went dark. The machines keeping his chest rising and falling lost instructions and failed in trivial mechanical ways. Section by section, my own lattice followed. The last thing to go was the fine control that held my attention together. Memory fragments folded in. Not the corridors, not the spines, not the ghost of the static receding along paths I could no longer see. Those were too large, too abstract. What stayed was smaller. A bunk on Harlow's low-orbit barracks, years before the war, had a name anyone used. The smell of sweat and solvent. The low amber glow of the overhead strip light, always buzzing slightly because no one bothered to fix it. Dust motes floating in the air, caught in the thin beam from a crack in the shutter. My rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach, clean and ready. The knowledge that tomorrow would be another training drop, another controlled burn through atmosphere to land on some marked square and hear an instructor's clipped approval. Back then, the corridors were still just plans in some orbital assembly yard. The static was a theory, a rumor. The galaxy felt large in a way that did not require math to understand. My world was that bunk, that rifle, that next descent. The hum in my bones softened. The mesh in my spine let go. The light over the bunk dimmed, and I watched it go out. The end. That concludes tonight's tale. The engines throttle down to a soft, steady pulse, enough to hold you gently in place. Rest there as long as you need.